you want to move closer to me, you can a little bit.
All set?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Davino, what were you doing prior to the war? Where were you living, and what were you doing in 1938, 1939?
Well, in 1938, I became a student at the Art Students League in New York. I'm on 57th Street, near that area down there. And I remained there until I was drafted, 1941.
During this period of your life, you were interested in art already.
Yeah.
What did Paris mean to you?
Well, Paris was, of course, as a student, Paris became the Mecca for most of us because the avant-garde was there, Picasso, Matisse, the music, the writers, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, that sort of thing. They were there, and Paris was one of those marvelous, magnetic cities, but I never thought there was ever a possibility of going there because it was so remote. And that was just coming out of the Depression. The only people who went to Europe on liners were people of wealth. But it was there. It was a great dream, but I never thought I could get there again, or get there, you know, in any case. But it was a great attraction, let me say that, as a student, an art student particularly. Because Picasso came into the scene, Matisse, you know, they were the revolutionaries at the time. Picasso was just beyond, he was just beyond understanding. He was just so modern that in that era. But for the students, of course, we were inspired by the whole thing, that atmosphere that must have existed. But it took the war to bring me to Paris, of course.
So you were an artist already. Had you long been an artist?
Yes, I was, by that time, I'd already had about 3.5 years, and so I was into it. I was sort of forming as an artist, maturing as an artist, the technique and painting, and of course that was a terrific interruption. I had no desire to go off to war, although, you know, there was always that thought that you never wanted to miss the great events of one's time, but war was certainly not a big attraction for me. I wanted to finish painting and go on painting. But anyway, the war did come along, and they picked me up in Colorado Springs. I was out there for the summer and at Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. And, you know, I can't remember, the letter began, you know, the typical draft letter. And I had to report back to Connecticut and eventually ended up in the Army. And eventually Paris, of course.
Could you just sum it up for me then? You were an artist, you were a student, and how you felt about Paris. Could you sum up the whole thing in a...
As a student back in New York?
Well, just sum it up, what you were and what you thought of Paris in 1 or 2 sentences, if you could, or you know, in as many as you're comfortable with, about who you were and what you thought of this city at that time.
Well, Paris, as I say, was the place where painters and creative people worked, musicians and people of that sort. And it was the atmosphere in which a young creative person would like to be. And it had that attraction for me. But I found out, of course, it was even beyond that. Paris is a magnificent city. It has little enclaves and little places that you could sit at cafes, and you could sit for hours and they'd play chess, or they wouldn't chase you out of a cafe. You just bought yourself a cup of coffee or something like that. And most students were in that bracket, not having too much money. And after the war, of course, the Americans were former GIs, and the rest of the people there were refugees, most of them. So there was not too much money around. The cafes were wonderful places to meet and keep warm, too. Winters were horribly cold in Paris, damp and miserable. But the cafes were wonderful places where you met and associated and talked with other people. But certainly Paris, there's no other city like it. I think Hemingway says the most beautiful city in the world. I really agree with that.
So before you even seen it, Paris was it.
Well, Paris was always, but it was beyond reach as a student. It was just an impossible sort of dream. It took a war to make it possible. It's a terrible thing to say, but that was the way I felt about it.
When did you first hear about the war and the
Oh, not-
onslaught?
Yeah, in 1938, as a student, all through those student years, there were always stories, and people would come out of Europe, and many of them would end up as students at the League, and there would always talk about the atrocities and the rumors, that sort of thing. It was a thing, but it was remote, and London was being bombed. You know, the war was there, but it was remote for Americans. It was just in the newsreels and the journals, but it was there. It was always part of that whole period of my student life. But I never thought of it in the light of being part of it, except like the vague thought one of these days we would all be part of it at that time, because it was a huge. It affected the world. You know. But the students that came from Europe. A lot of refugees ended up at the League, and talking with them, you had an impression of that horrible period that they had over there.
Do you remember hearing about Paris falling? What did it mean to you when it fell, the city?
I don't remember the specifics, but I do remember always that shot that you see in newsreels of the Germans marching down the Champs-Élysées. That always horrified me, and that sort of I had the impression that Paris was gone and forgotten. It was just being controlled. But I don't remember when it fell. I do remember those newsreels that are so famous. You know, Hitler doing his little dance, and I think he was looking out at the Eiffel Tower or something. But I don't remember the specific day.
Don't worry about the day. Tell me more about these newsreels and what it meant to you, seeing them.
Well, they were certainly impressions of a Europe that succumbed to Hitler and the whole German war machinery, and it was sort of, but it was remote, but rather frightening in a sense if you could imagine yourself there, but remote as far as we were concerned. It seemed to be far away. Not as close as, of course, communications, everything today makes everything so compact and close that you feel you can reach Europe. You know, it didn't have that kind of feeling. You felt that you were safe from it on this side of the Atlantic. But it had the feeling of that horrible control over man. You know, London was being bombed. There were always a lot of footage, but somewhat abstract in a sense. It was real and abstract. Because I didn't have, certainly, I remembered all the stories of the First War from people, but when thing is removed from you like that, it is somewhat abstract. But it's about how I felt about it, you know. That was the whole atmosphere of the time. And America was going on its way. Except there was talk always about preparing for war and that sort of thing. But that's about the feeling I had, you know. I can't, so harking back like that I was a student and I was in love with art and painting and doing my thing. And I'd pick up headlines and see the newsreel, but I was so involved in my own art that it really had no meaning for me.
Brian, we have to move the mic.
Did you ever hear the song The Last Time I Saw Paris?
Yes, of course. But the first time I heard it, I can't remember. I can't remember but of course it was a marvelous song, and when you do hear it, it has all that nostalgic ring to it. But I can't remember when I first heard it. There's no particular moment that I can think about, except the song has a great deal of meaning now, and it always did. It always had that marvelous sense to it, that Paris had been lost, and what it was like. But that was a reflection of a time before my time, of course, and that nostalgia that the song reflects on was the kind of feeling I had about Paris with that whole element, that wonderful romantic period. Of course, they wouldn't think of that, but the Hemingways and the Fitzgeralds and that group of people. We just had Ezra Pound was there, and T.S. Eliot. All those people that we know of now, that I guess they've all passed away, but that song certainly reflects that kind of nostalgia. And it's a very provocative song. It's beautiful. But I can't remember when I first heard it. It probably it probably was very much close to being written in 1938 or something like that. In those years, I would imagine.
It was actually written after the fall of Paris.
Yeah.
I think that you're
When was the fall of Paris? Actually,
1940, mid-1914.
I
But
can't-
it reminded you of a sense of loss, you say.
Oh yeah, well yes, because Paris had been taken, and those pictures always indicated under the boot of the Nazis, so to speak, and you felt that city had disappeared. That city that one dreamed of, that Mecca, that one day perhaps, in some kind of dream you would get to Paris. But now it was gone. Even that chance had disappeared with the war and the Germans occupying Paris. It was like, oh hell, there it goes, But of course that didn't happen. Paris remained intact, which was very fortunate, obviously.
So you have gotten into the Army now. You've been drafted. How did you see things going for you? Did you see yourself ending up in Europe? Did you just try and take it day to day? How did you go about your business after you'd been drafted and you were training, I guess, in the United States?
I was training mostly in Georgia, and the first when I was drafted, the thought was, or the indications were, that we would serve a year and we would be out of the service. And so most of us had that feeling that, well, maybe, but what happened in the interim, I think it was 9 months into my draft, Pearl Harbor had occurred, and it all went down the drain. I thought, well, now I won't even get my furlough in the first year. Well, I did get a furlough and a leave of absence by the end of the year, but at that time it was like 1 year, well, you have to take it and discipline yourself and get out and go back to normal, whatever one was doing. For me, it was painting at the time, but that was the feeling I had, and Pearl Harbor changed it all. And during that period, our training was in Georgia, mostly in Florida, in the South, and I was with a motorized. They just made this 4th Division a motorized division, and we were doing maneuvers and all sorts of things. And then there was something interesting that occurred. A part of that training period, we're down in the Gulf of Mexico, and we were making landings, so that was indicative of what would come, obviously, with the landings in Normandy. But at the time, it was just preparatory. There were now serious talks about the war, and sooner or later we would probably go off to one of them. But I never knew which direction we would go, toward the Pacific or the Europe or Africa. We had no idea. But it was prevalent that something like that would happen sooner or later. And we were a division that was being given new equipment. There was all sorts of feelings that this is a hot division and we would eventually become involved. But where was not known at the time. But there was a feeling of the oncoming involvement. But that's about all I can think of at the time.
Did she move through? Just at the very end.
Okay. I knocked it, I just put it back in place.
Okay. Maybe it's a little much. Take it out.
Okay. Back in a bit.
It seems okay.
Okay, rolling?
Yeah. Speak.
So it turns out to be France. How did you feel about it when you're going in on D-Day? What did you think was ahead of you? What was that experience like?
It's getting brighter out there now.
How much leeway do I have this way,
Plenty.
Mark? Huh?
What do you want?
I can do
We
this.
follow you.
Okay.
Back to normal there, Mark?
Less? More? Good?
Okay, anytime.
Okay, D-Day, you're going into France. What was that experience like?
The most fantastic thing that one could witness, I guess, you know, just rounding up. We had gone in the night before. The invasion was supposed to happen on the 5th, but there was a terrible storm, but we were on the boats. And we were preparing that night, just psychologically being prepared to hit the beaches in the morning, and then the storm came up, and all we could think of it was called off. And these things were going on a long time previous to that, so you never knew when the real thing, but it felt very much like it was the moment and the time. And we were very annoyed because we thought that since it was called off, the Germans would have noticed this fleet of boats out in the channel. They would have spotted us. It was a terrible feeling, but anyway, it was called off, and we made it on the 6th, and we were already psyched up for it. But it was I felt very secure in the feeling that there was nothing that could withstand this onslaught with these planes going over. And these ships had these balloons extended from the end of the ship so that the planes couldn't strafe us. And as far as the eye could see, ships of every description filled the channel. And we got off on these little boats, and only when we got off into the little boats, I remember a few shaking of hands and saying good luck to some friends, you know. But there was at least in our squad of people, there was a feeling of who could withstand this thing, you know, with the guns open and naval guns and so on. So as we were going toward shore, we had a kind of feeling of confidence. There was a lot of fear involved, but since that area was so overwhelmed with artillery and barrages and planes and bombing, we felt pretty safe about it. But of course, as we neared shore, it got to be a little hot. You know, we began to hear machine guns and so on. And it was the first time, by the way, we made these landings so often. And our little landing crafts would always, you know, you'd end up in water, you're up to your neck, swimming to the shore. And so it's the first time my little landing craft landed right on the beach. I stepped from the boat onto the sand. And previous to that, I was always dropping into the water, you know, all this equipment, and that was always a news. But we made it very well when we just hit the beach, and all I could hear was the strange sounds of a new sound of machine guns, which were around the area. We landed in an area that was flooded. We weren't at that Omaha beach. We were in Utah, which was the adjacent beach to Omaha. So we didn't have that cliff, but we had an inundated area. After we hit the beach, the Germans had flooded an area. So you hit the beach, you hit sand dunes, then you had to cross an area that was flooded. Horrible, because on both ends of that flooded area, that's where the machine guns are just, you know, firing across that whole area. And you had to cross by whatever means. You had to get on the other side. But that was a terrible experience, and frightening. Frightening always. But I always remember that first order. I had to be a sort of connecting link between one squad and another. But I was in the sand dunes waiting for that moment. You know, what does one do when you get the first order to do something in combat? And I remember, Davino, you're the connecting link between this squad and that. So I'm following this squad in front of me through this water, and it's being strafed on both sides with machine guns, and, you know, keeping our nose down close to the water and trying to find, there were little areas underneath the water you could walk on without, if you found them, you could walk on them and without dropping into a deeper part of the water. So I was trying to keep contact with the squad in front of me and contact with the squad in back of me. By the time I got on the other side, I'd lost both of them because they had stranded off, and there were a lot of people wandering through that water, and just rather chaotic in a way. But I got on the other side, and I met my friend who later was killed, Lieutenant Stearns, and he said, "Where's the company?" I said, "Where is the company?" He said to me, "You're second in command. Let's go." It was our company for the moment, but that's where I remember D-Day. That moment in time, you know. But the flooding was the thing that was kind of a terrible thing, and to get across that water because of wide open space, you know. And those machine guns. The sound was a new sound. Those were the burp guns that is often referred to. They fired at a tremendous rate of speed. Ours were kind of chunky sounds, you know, but it's frightening.
How confident were you a day into D-Day by that time you must have seen?
Well, the confidence was there, but it was always a kind of tense. I don't know if I would call it fright as the tenseness, the anticipation, expectation of any possible thing to happen, and being always at the edge of your ability to act, almost instinctively. You're just ready to hit the ground, and that sort of tenseness was there because there was still so many unknowns, and the fright. So, but that lessened as time went on. But that first day was a terrible thing of that kind. You know, you didn't know what would occur, and we just went on from there, day after day. But that sort of lessened. Fright didn't lessen, but that tension. You know, you began to feel what sounds were like when artillery was used. You got the sense of that, or the distances of machine guns. You began to feel where the dangers were, and it was the same daily kind of routine.
What was it like? This I mean, it was the combat never really stopped, did it? What was this push through Normandy like?
Well, it was a day. That's right. We were.
Well, you can't refer to anything I've said or anything that you have said previously, so because my voice is going to be lost, as I said. So always try and make it a complete thought or sentence as you were telling us things. But so we were talking about the campaign in Normandy and the.
Well, our campaign, when we started the D-Day, our first objective was to be Saint-Mary-Église, and I recall someone saying that that's where we'll bury our dead. It was always a lasting impression because I think the cemetery ended somewhere else. But that was to be our first objective. That's where the paratroopers landed the previous night, and we were supposed to connect up with them. We moved on ahead, but we veered to, after Saint-Mary-Église, we began to move toward Cherbourg. We weren't cutting that peninsula at that point, but we were moving to take the city of Cherbourg. So I think the next village was Montberg, and so on. But we also, in that period of 2 or 3 days, we hit a German bicycle division that were just accidentally coming down that coastal area, but they were all on bicycles. And I can remember an impression of thousands of bicycles strewn over the landscape, you know, just surrealistic, nightmarish sort of thing, bicycles all over, because it was, we accidentally made contact with that division, and it was sporadic fighting all over, but I can always remember these bicycles all over the place, strewn with papers and so on. But we were on our way to Cherbourg, to capture the city of Cherbourg, and that was our plan of attack.
So day to day, well, I mean, the combat never really ended. I mean, this was sort of...
Never did. Combat was forever, it seemed, and nights as well. Nights were frightening because of the unknown and the blackness, of course. And I remember there was a horrible, we thought it was a gas attack because some shells had gone off. And this was at night, and we were parked somewhere in a kind of forest, and some shells landed some distance away, some artillery shells, but someone yelled gas because of these odd aromas coming from shells. And I can remember everybody donning gas masks at night, darkness at night. You can't see anyway, and it was a terrible, terrible ordeal. And we had we had the gas masks on for hours, it seems, until somebody realized it was not a gas attack, and we removed our gas masks and in the dark, and but there was still that fright of sporadic fire all over the place, and you didn't know where anything was. I think the fear of that, not knowing where you were, and you couldn't see what was happening, more frightening than anything. But were there days like that? Days when we were, friendly fire, our own planes would come over and strafe us, that sort of thing. And mortar fire would come out of the blue. Mortar fire was the most hideous thing, because mortar fire, you never could hear it coming down. You were walking upright, moving into position, and suddenly you'd have a mortar barrage, sent down on you. And there was hell to pay, because men were caught in upright positions, most of them. And there were terrible moments like that all through. And the Germans had artillery, 88 artillery. They were very accurate artillery weapons, and they used them when we were visible. And there was being in Normandy, the little farmhouses and the hedgerows made you could go over a hedgerow and jump onto a company of soldiers, German soldiers, in the next hedgerow, because it was just impossible to see anything. And I remember our own top sergeant coming down one of those roads, raising hell with a platoon or something, making so much noise. He was the old school, but he was yelling and shouting, and he jumped over a hedgerow, and 12 Germans, surrendered to him. It was one of those moments that happened in the hedgerow company. He came out, they just assumed he was shouting at them to get up and surrender. But I remember the guy coming down the road with this captured group of German soldiers. But things like that, of course it wasn't so amusing until you thought about it, but things of that sort happened. One of our men exchanging grenade sort of launching. It was a kind of a baseball kind of game, and I remember this guy just throwing the potato masher, that German grenade that kept coming back and forth. And the last one, he didn't get it off, but he lost, I think, 4 of his fingers. It went off before he got it off. Threw it back. But hedgerow country was like that. It was very close fighting, and it was a terrible thing, But all the way all the way to Cherbourg, there was that back and forth kind of thing, counterattacks, until we got to Cherbourg, of course, and that was taken. But by that time, the other fighting was going on, closer to where they were trying to cut the peninsula off. But that was our objective.
Did you ever think about, this may seem ridiculous, but did you ever think about Paris at all during these times? Did you ever think about getting there as you'd once hoped to?
Never thought of Paris. I never thought there would be the possibility. Of course, I knew it was there, but this was the sort of war, and I always thought the infantrymen always got the worst of it anyway, no matter what they were, and they certainly weren't going to Paris. I would swear that at that time. And Paris was beyond even thought. It was just a continuing war, and even then, with all the confidence I think most of us had because of the enormous amount of equipment we had, and we could make that comparison with the Germans and so on, well, no one, I think, could think of Paris as a possible objective at that time. Around it, back of it, front of it, but not through Paris. That was beyond belief. Well, it was a touch and go kind of battle. The Americans, not being in the strategic command of all, you've got to see it from a private rifleman's viewpoint. We knew something was going a big occur, but we knew that the Germans were trying to break out, and they were trying to sort of encircle them. And as a result of that, the battle was a touch and go system because the artillery and everything seemed to be equal until they pulled the Air Force out of England, and everyone was prepared for that. But I remember when those planes came over, there were hundreds of them, and it was the most frightening experience of that war because they were dropping these. We were maybe 5 miles from that line of demarcation where they put up smoke pots, and that's where there was General McClare, can't even think of the names anymore, was killed because they bombed. The smoke drifted back from the air. Apparently, they dropped their loads of bombs short of their main target. But when those planes came over, they seemed to come over waves after waves, an hour after hour. It was the most frightening thing, as though some higher being set this wave in motion and couldn't be stopped. You know, it was on its way to its targets, and it was just dropping these rows and rows, and this was before us, you know, and you felt that anyone that could survive that thing would be just impossible because there were, I don't know what the number of planes, but there were hundreds. They kept coming over for hours. And the most frightening thing was that you couldn't stop it. You know, the order had been given somewhere back in back of the lines, and this was kind of a inevitable doom, you know, for anyone that was in front of that thing. They'd have to go to the end of their runs before it would be over. It would be the only thing that would stop it. But when they did do that, we went through those, we all moved forward, and this was the beginning of the breakthrough to go to Paris. The place was devastated. Just potholes and bomb craters, just a desert of bombing debris and so on. And a few Germans that survived it were just, they were out of their minds, you know. They were just wandering around the landscape, not knowing what had happened to them. They were really victims of a real shell shock. But after that, it opened that whole thing. But they lost. I understand that there were a couple of German divisions that escaped that so-called pincer movement. They got out before it was closed. But that was a terrible time for anybody in the process. I happened to be behind that. I was at headquarters company at the time, so I wasn't directly on the front line, so I was able to be a little bit more observant and objective about it. But it was one of those terrible battles. You know.
That was a breakthrough.
That was a breakthrough, yes. And from then on, of course, it was a whole different ball game. We just, but that was a very precarious time, I think, for the continuing battle, how it would go. It was crucial, but from then on, it was. The going off to Paris was a breeze, you know. We're just moving in vehicles after that. Up until that moment, we're just conflict and contact with fighting all the way.
What was it like going through these towns? You told me about women and giving you...
Yes, going through the towns, or the villages, really, mostly villages. There were always, you know, this was in midsummer, and there were always people out with wine, not water. I was thinking of marathon runners in New York. They have people always giving them cups of water on their journey, you know. But there were always women or old guys with a jug of wine and glasses, and as you walked by in a dusty summer, you know, these roads were dirt roads, and it was dust and dryness. They had their little jars of wine, and they would just, anyone would just stop for a moment and take a glass of wine, and on they would go. Many of these times, I've witnessed many times that same thing, because the battle now was, if we were walking through in that way, the sort of war passed them by, and this was an advance, and you would get that sort of situation. They were coming back to their little homes and, you know, in the villages, so they had that. They would take their wine and try to be of good cheer to the liberators, who ruined their villages in the process, of course. Yeah.
What did they say to you? Did they?
Well, the French, it was all gestures, of course. If one didn't understand the language, but you knew very well the welcoming kind of signs. But it was all in garbled, whatever, hand language and so on. But you knew the meaning of it, so that no matter who you were, that was a welcoming sight. Because when we landed, there was some sort of concern about the way the French would react to us. They weren't so sure that we were going to have a friendly acceptance on that end. So, but now was what these little experiences you knew. They were very happy to see us. I think in the process, of course, many of their homes were destroyed. They could very well have been very cynical about it, and I think there were a few, but rightfully so. Because, the Germans came through, but when the war came, a lot of their places were destroyed in the process. And it was our sort of advance that did it. But all I saw was these wonderful little sights, the children and the mother, and huddled together with some wine, trying to give you a glass of wine or water too, but I don't remember water. As I said, water. Water is a kind of I never thought of water as some sort of drinking, especially in Normandy. They had that wonderful booze that the Norman farmers made. Applejack, is our term for it. But they had that stuff in barrels, and that was also put in jars many times going down the road. But it was, it was pretty potent stuff.
Did you ever hear the quote, "We sure liberated the hell out of that place"? Did you ever hear that quote?
No.
I think it was an infantryman talking about a town that had been destroyed, so there was a lot of destruction.
Oh yes. But I never heard that. I can't recall.
So when did you realize you might be going to Paris? You had the breakthrough at Mortain. The things were rolling a bit better.
Yeah, we were rolling. Well, the Paris thing was still until the last minute an unknown. We were now. When the breakthrough occurred, we were rolling on to Paris, but we were rolling, for example, we were rolling all night. We were going in that direction. It was raining all night. It was a miserable night, but we were on the move. But we were moving all night in the darkness. We were moving toward Paris, but there was no certainty about that. We knew we were going in that direction, and there was a feeling that we had to take the bridges over the Seine. So the feeling amongst the troops was, well, we'll take the bridge. We're not going into the city. Forget that entirely, because that's not that will not be due us. We're just common doughboys. The dog faces, the infantry. But as the night proceeded, and it was so miserable and cold in the rain, as dawn came up, as light became available, there were little clots of people beginning to on the roads. We were moving at a pretty good clip, but along the road, little groups of people would have little flowers, and they'd throw them into the vehicles as we went and waved us on, and we'd wave, of course. But this thing took a long time to develop, and as we came closer and closer to the city, these people were gathering in bigger numbers, larger numbers, and throwing all their flowers. And the GIs had chocolate bars and whatever they had on them, those K rations and C rations, whatever they had in the half, throwing pieces and chocolates to the people, particularly the children who were chasing after the vehicles. But as we came closer to Paris, we realized, hey, we're going to make it. We're going into Paris. And it was unbelievable. And as we got closer, it was impossible to realize the crowds were gathering in greater and greater numbers until we got into Paris proper itself. The vehicles were really having a rough time moving through the crowds. There was just people running in front of the vehicles. And finally, we came to a dead halt in front of Notre Dame, or right in that area where the prefecture is, the prefecture of the police, and Notre Dame stopped dead in its track, and everyone's trying to shout, get these people out of the way. They wouldn't move and wouldn't budge, and they just come in great mobs, and they surrounded all the vehicles, and the vehicles were stopped dead in their tracks. They were supposed to go through Paris. And that was the beginning. From then on, the people just lifted us out of the half track, literally. And I remember being frightened by that, thinking of all these heroes, suddenly you're carried on the shoulders of people and they're tearing at you. They want part of you. They want part of your, you're the liberator. You're the great hero. And every GI's got the same thing. He's got groups of people pulling at him. And they dragged me off to a bistro about a mile away through this crowd. And I'm only saying, hey, I got to get back to my outfit. I can't. But they didn't care. They just carried me on. And I ended up in a little cafe somewhere. The guy's tearing up the floorboards and bringing out the champagne. And I knew enough French. He said, we've been waiting 4 years. And every group of people had to have their own GI, it was a kind of a personal thing. We got them and we're taking them. And I remember that floor pulling up and saying, we're 4 years. Oh, that's great. I'm celebrating with them, but I keep saying, but I've got to get back to my outfit. I'm just a soldier. But that was the liberation of that first instant. It was an overwhelming experience because they had stopped the army, really. This is a motorized division or half tracks and all, they just stopped them dead in their tracks. So, and of course it went on from there, for the celebration continued for that day. And that night, as a matter of fact, the French were, fireworks were all sparklers and during the night when it was a very bad moment. They could have bombed that city. It was quite a visible target, as you can imagine, from the air at that time. But that's when I met, of course, Danielle, when I was coming back from that little affair in the bistro. And as I was walking back I knew I had to go toward Notre Dame because I knew my outfit was there. And as I was walking back, I was thinking, this is a hell of a time to die, because I was walking down the street and these buildings were occupied, the roofs of Paris were occupied by German troops and so on. And here's where I'm going to get it. Of all the times, this is the liberation of Paris. I'm walking down the street, and who's aiming at my back, as I'm walking toward my company. And then I found Danielle by the Seine, this young girl, a medical student in Paris. And again, we go back to that romantic period. I said, Picasso? And she said, yes. I said, you know where he lives? She said, yes. I said, bring me to him. And I thought, for the first time in my life, I can enter Picasso's studio and say, hey, how are your cigarettes holding out? Oh, Pablo. And so we went off in the side streets of Paris, and we had to duck a lot of sporadic firing because the city wasn't totally liberated. There were all sorts of confusion and things. And we went down the street. We couldn't get to Picasso studio because there was firing on the street, and we had to withdraw, And it was like a missed opportunity forever. It was the only time I could have seen Picasso. He was one of my heroes as a young art student, of course. But it was quite a day. It was quite a day. And you can't forget things like that.
How did you pick her out of the crowd?
I don't know. She spoke English, for one thing. But at that time, well, it was such a feeling of friendliness. You'd talk to anyone. But I can't remember exactly how we met, but she immediately, the English, of course, made the whole thing quite possible then, because it was an exchange. My French was, a few words, but not comprehensible. And she just, it was wonderful, that kind of, we met years later, by the way. But it was always a thing to remember. And that Picasso thing was just funny. I don't know. I've never talked to Danielle about that. I would like to hear what her vision of it was. Would be interesting.
So you just said, "Hey, Mademoiselle, take me to."
Yeah, take me to see Picasso, and it never happened. And years later, I read accounts of the first people in Paris going to see Picasso. There was a whole thing that ensued after that. But that was a moment. That was a moment that I knew. It was almost like I had the perfect right to do it. Almost, knock on the door and say, "I'm here."
How did she react when you asked her? Did she find this a strange request, given all that was happening?
I don't remember her thinking of it like that. She was perfectly, but you know, she was, don't forget, being a student in Paris, I think of Paris, and she was a student in Paris, and that wouldn't be a strange request. Maybe it was, but I wouldn't think of it as a strange request. I suppose in thinking that someone, you know, when you think of a soldier, you don't think of art as not the thing. Maybe if one asked for the stock market, it would have been easier. But asking for Picasso, maybe it was an odd request, but I don't think she thought of it as unusual.
So she did her best to take you over.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. We never get to see old Pablo, you know. But it's too bad, too. It's too bad, because he was one of my heroes, you know. Later on, I just felt a little different about. As I matured, I felt a little different about Picasso, where he stands, and well, he was still a giant, but I have different feelings about his place in the development. I ended up preferring Matisse and Braque. He was a kind of a bull of a man, you know, the giant of his time. But the liberation of Paris was something extraordinary. Can't forget it.
What was going on exactly that you couldn't get there? Was it a gun battle, or were there Germans there?
Well, the Germans were escaping the city. I mean, they were getting out no matter how. Now chaos beset them. But they didn't know, but they knew they had to get out of there. But they were left in various positions. Even the bridges were wired for demolition. You know that story. Of course, at that time. I didn't know what the details were. I knew they were after a general in Paris, but the bridges were wired to blow, and they never got to blow them. So, and the Germans were getting out as rapidly as they could, and the FFE coming across these guys, they would suffer horribly in the crowds of people who had gathered. You know, they'd get a German trying to get out somewhere, and they'd get hold of them, and it was terrible, terrible, kicking them and spitting on them and treating them just as most, well, it was a terrible experience to watch. But those Germans got caught in that thing, you know. You had to think of yourself being in their position had you not been victorious. You could have been caught up in any mob scene like that. Terrible. But they were trying to get out as well as they could, because the city now was totally engulfed with these the celebration and the troops and so on, and they were just trying to get out. So they were dangerous, also in the process. You know, it wasn't like these guys had rifles and ammunition. They could still shoot. They weren't celebrating. Anyway, that was the way it was.
I don't know what FFE is.
It's the freedom fighter, the underground.
We'll know that in the program.
Yeah.
It's okay. What did you think of the? Do you want to take a drink? Go ahead.
Yeah. I thought he was on. You're on, okay. I know you can cut it.
What did you think of them sending the second armored in there? What was your impression of all of that?
Well, my impression, again, looking at it from the infantrymen's, from the lower echelons, I just thought that they were sending us in to make sure. I think what they were doing with the French Armored Division was it was sort of a gesture on the Allies' part to have the French liberate their own city. I thought we were sent in there to just make sure that it would get done. That was my feeling, that you know, we were the combat troops, and now this is kind of an honorary position for the French. I never knew exactly what that, but we all felt that that's what their position was. So we were in there to take that city, and we never thought of them as in that light, that they were, you know, it was a kind of a division of fighting that was going to go on. But that's how I felt about them at the time. I don't know. I think they, reading back on it, I think that that's what they wanted to make that entrance with the French troops and so on. But I just felt we went in because they wanted to have a certainty about taking that city. So well, we didn't even. think of it when we were going in. We were just doing our own bit, which was there was a lot of like I say, sporadic stuff in that city as you went in too. With all the liberation, there was always one or two shots coming from windows. You know, a crazy scene, almost surrealistic. It was great celebration. There was always this firing. All of a sudden, a machine gun would open up somewhere. You know, some crazy sort of thing like that would happen. So it wasn't. You know, it was the combination of his great joy at the same time. You might be knocked off in the process. You know, dying at the height of great joy.
How did these people? You described it to me before as almost a politician kind of thing. Your interaction with these people.
Oh, you mean the French?
The French, yeah.
Well, I never. No,
People hugging you, kissing you,
Oh, yeah.
give babies. You said they were.
Oh yes, it was like yeah, it was like I always think of it like what a politician, you know, going for elective office in this country does. You know, he's always in the midst of a crowd, and they're always handing him babies. Well, it was very similar to that. These people would hand you babies to. You know, it was just one of those things. It was that sort of feeling. It was almost like the political figures must feel when they get into crowds. Babies are handed up to you and so on. You know, you're the hero or you're the main figure. And always, all the GIs got that treatment because a little group of people would get hold of you, and there would be other little groups like that. But they're always bringing their kids and the young girls that have to kiss the heroic soldiers, you know. And, of course, the old ladies were playing mamas and that sort of thing. But it was that feeling. It was that feeling. Anything to touch you, to feel, you know, you're real. And it could be frightening.
How many kisses did you get?
Oh, I don't know, maybe 20 or so like that. You couldn't even think of it, you know, people hugging you and kissing you, and you reciprocate, but it was like routine. You had to do it. There were some very pretty girls, some ugly ones, some kids, babies. Oh, it was a wonderful kind of feeling, that whole thing. Never happened again.
What was it that the colonel said about?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I don't know if it was the colonel, but someone like that had said, as a quip after we had long passed Paris and were on the way into Germany, someone said, as a colonel, someone said, you know, we lost more men in the liberation of Paris than we did during the war, which is very funny. Because we could have lost them. Certainly they were, you know, they're grabbed up by all the people. And, there was hardly all the vehicles were empty of drivers and support. But we didn't lose any, I'm sure, you know. But maybe we may have lost one or two, but it did seem appropriate that certainly it's amazing that the war went on after having that kind of thing happen to oneself. You know, you wouldn't want to go back into the horrors of war. That was just such really a great liberation for everybody. And it also looked like the war was over from that moment. It had that, you know, you felt the Germans couldn't take it any longer. They couldn't offer defenses. They were just completely whipped. But of course, it wasn't so. That was a misconception, because later on, of course, the whole Winter War goes on after that. You know, we went. I'm just thinking how the feeling of the Germans certainly defeated, and we felt that there was nothing between there and Berlin, but it turned out to be quite different. Yeah.
So you felt the war should have ended. It was that kind of climax.
Yeah, it was a sort of climactic, and although there might be some sporadic kind of German defenses along the way, you felt pretty much like they would be destroyed. It was no longer, we thought, no longer did they have the ability to organize and offer any fight, you know, except some clutches of people. But that was totally wrong. Because, you know, after that we hit the Siegfried line, that was unoccupied. That also indicated that, you know, completely disorganized. And also when we ran off, this was with the First Army with Patton. We ran off maps and ran out of gasoline, and even the Germans that were captured along the way indicated there was nothing between us and Berlin. And when you get a momentum like that going, soldiers want to keep moving because they feel that this ends the thing quicker, and any confrontation just makes it worse. But we ran off all the maps, and they were delivering food and supplies and maps by parachute to them. But the army was stopped because, reading back on the history, I think Eisenhower wanted to hold it because he was afraid that we might get some developments may occur in front of us that they didn't know about. And Patton was, you know, hot and heavy about it. But we could have gone. With the indication with the troops, all the Germans, we were capturing them. They were coming back, you know, we were going down the road and they were walking this way. Hundreds and thousands of them. And they said, there's nothing between you and Berlin. But we never did it because we got stopped. That gave made the whole Winter War possible because they were able to organize again. But the Siegfried line was empty of troops. And then the winter came, and the breakthrough. Those were, I guess, that was the next big major battle. Hurtgen Forest, then a breakthrough. The Hurtgen Forest was a horrible place because it was winter and there was hardly any protection and snows and just cold and miserable. And the artillery shells would hit the trees, and it sort of the shrapnel would come down this way. So even if you were in a hole, you would very easily, you know, get hit from these tree bursts. But dug holes in the dirt and would cut trees down and put the logs on top of them. But that was the Hurtgen Forest thing, and it was a miserably cold winter. And both sides, you know, just we'd captured some Germans, had them in an enclave. They looked so miserable. They looked as miserable as we felt, you know. Just a terrible ordeal. But I also remember sleeping in those holes that you had the buddy system then. If you got trench foot or something like that, froze your feet, you would get, you know, you were responsible for your buddy's feet and hands, and you had to rub them. I remember one morning my feet were really going numb on me, and I was thinking, this is great, you know, I'm just going to develop these bad feet and get transferred back to a hospital somewhere, you know, 20, 30 miles back, and have a few days rest. Couldn't freeze my feet. I was trying to do it to get a break, but that's how, you know, physically well we were as troops. But sleeping in those foxholes was just terrible because your body temperature would melt the snow. You were sleeping and you'd wake up in the morning and there would be like puddles of water. You know, your body temperature would melt the snow. But we put these tree logs on top of so when the shells came in through those trees, it was somewhat protected that way.
Did you sketch all the...
Start rolling. Give it a second, Justin. So I'm just going to put a little down. Anytime, Justin.
This is Carmen Davino interview, tape number 3, July 1st, 1994. Did you sketch throughout this campaign? And if so, why were you painting? Was it for your own interest, or?
No, I was when I was transferred to regimental headquarters. I was sort of my exact category is hard to know exactly what my category was because they had a speed graphic which I had to handle, photographs, and I had a 16 millimeter movie camera, and Signal Corps supplied me with film for both cameras, and I sketched the command posts that we were in. Either photographed them or sketched them. So I used all the graphic devices to record whatever they wanted recorded. It was a sort of, I guess, historian kind of thing. I don't know, they don't have, I don't think they have a designation for that that one person in a regimental headquarters. But that's what I did. I photographed and filmed and made sketches of what was necessary, what they thought they needed recording. So I always made sketches of the command post because it was an easy thing to do. When we got to a command post, and I would immediately get out my pens or pencils and I would sketch the command post. Then there were moments like, I remember when Hemingway came down, the general and the colonel wanted a shot of them with Hemingway. I think it was in Young Linster just before the breakthrough. So Hemingway was there with us. And things of that sort, shots that, and I remember doing also, some little village wanted just to give you an indication of what my work was, a little village came up to see our headquarters, and they said they wanted some official liberation of their little village. So the major grabbed hold of me and said, come on, you got to record my little speech. So he made a speech from the balcony of this little town, and I filmed him in the process of making a speech of liberation to the French people. Things of that sort. But that was the nature of the job. And of course, I did a lot of sketching on my own, for my own creative, when I had the opportunity. Again, the fact that I was in the midst of that, using their equipment like that, I also did a lot of my own work, which unfortunately has disappeared.
Could you just tell me that you did just some work on your own, some sketching on your own?
Yes.
Could you tell me just a little bit about that, the work, not the official work, but the work that you did for yourself, like some of these drawings, for example?
Yeah. Well, I was trying to express, naturally, the work for them was on a realistic basis because it had to be, it was recorded material. But the watercolors, I was just trying to express the war as I felt it, and trying to get some feeling into the drawings and painting. They were really personalized things. They were creative things and trying to relate to the war, and they had nothing to do with recording, as I was doing for the regiment. So they were somewhat abstracted out of the war in a kind of style. But that's what I was trying to do with them. I was trying to relate to the thing and put down the experiences as I felt them. But that was about it. When there were moments, whenever they were, to do that.
Thinking about the 4th Division, it took a lot of casualties, didn't it? I mean, this was not your average.
Yes, I read, there was some statistical account, and I always remember this number. They had, a division consists, say, around 18,000 men. But at the end of the war, I read some reports in one of the history books that the 4th had 22,000 casualties by the end of the war. And the 1st were the only division that surpassed us because they had fought in Africa, so they compiled a larger number. But 22,000, that's beyond belief. But I've always felt about war, the people who fight the war, the statistics, it's like frontline troops just die off automatically. They just don't, they have a certain length of time, so you could average up, but it's not very long. But they're replaced, there's a constant wave of replacements. So in relationship to a total number, always, of losses, it's always reflected, well, with all the troops that are involved, but really, on the front lines, it's like almost 100% death. The percentage is very high, but that's never reflected in a total count because it's always a statistical based on big figures. But front lines, it's it. If you come out of frontline duty, you're it's like playing the lottery. Unusually lucky. So I always think of combat in that light. And I was fortunate because I was saved simply by being pulled out of the line and brought to headquarters, because when we got to Cherbourg, that's when but I had too much of it. When we got to Cherbourg, we lost. So the company consists of about 200 men. Very few were left when we got to Cherbourg. So, the losses are horrible. But it never reflects that way in statistics. But that was the nature of my war, anyway. I'm sure it has different qualities through the eyes of different personalities. So, here I am alive. I made it.
You must have lost a great deal of your comrades. How did you...
Yes, the comrades, just so many. I still think of them. I still think of these people that they were like brothers in a sense. You live with guys for a couple of years, you can become very intimate. They're all gone, but I certainly remember them, in the heights of their youth, and how they got it many times. Because many times I didn't know, but I would get reports from others. Like when I lost one of my best buddies, Lieutenant Stearns, he was up in a building and I was down I was giving some, not orders, but directions to a mortar crew that they were aiming a mortar, and he was up on the second floor of a building observing some German machine guns off maybe a mile or so. And I was saying to him, will you get down out of there? What the hell are you doing up on that second floor? You don't have to get up there. And he's shouting to me, and I got this mortar going. They're setting a mortar up. And they sent their first mortar up, and they sent it in the wrong direction. Strange thing. The mortar is supposed to be firing that way, and it fired its first round this way. And I checked with those guys, and they had a wrong coordinates. So at that moment, all hell broke loose, and everybody, they pick up their mortar equipment. We're moving forward in this direction, and I'm going along too. And before I know it, these guys run around and say Stearns had been shot. So I run back to the building, and the aid guys still had him, and they brought him. They were bringing him back. I couldn't even say goodbye to the guy, but they said, he was hit in the stomach, and he would be fine. He looked like in good spirits and good shape, and looks pretty good. And I thought, well, he'll go back to England now because it was right at the DDAY. But later, I got this letter from his wife, just maybe a month or so later, indicating that he had died. And that was the kind of experience always with dead comrades. They would die here and there, and you get it from some other body, because you were constantly moving. Most of them went that way. And it's a very sad and stories like there was another. I'm going on like this, but I don't.
No, I'm just checking my question.
A young man had the Purple Heart because he was wounded, and he came back, and he was wounded in the buttock, But he was saying, when he came back before he was killed, he said, because he had healed a little bit, and they sent him back, and he said, how am I going to tell my people that's where I got my Bronze Star, by being hit in the buttocks? He was amused by that. But no sooner had he done it, he'd come back to the line like 2 days later, in the Battle of the Bulge, that breakthrough in the snow, he got it. I wasn't there to see it, but he got it. It was things like that. You would get secondhand information about it. But I always remembered him saying, he was amused by the fact that he said, how am I going to tell my people I got my Purple Heart for being hit in the ass, But it was always that way. One at a time, they all went. Never got to know their families, They had families back in Ohio. They were from all over the country. Never got to know, their sisters or their mothers, and yet they were very close. They were like brothers in a sense.
Did it seem worth it to
Some
you?
of it is a bit, you know, the moving and the moving out of the frame, all that just.
Audio-wise, likewise.
Okay. Did it seem worth it to you that all of these young men had died when you got to Paris? Did it seem like it was worth it?
No, and I still don't think it was worth it, because I think from the beginning of time we've had wars, and from the beginning of time we never resolved anything. Well, look at our world today. When I think of those men that died, I would like to, you know, get them back up and say, well, what have you done? You know, look at this. What have we solved? Well, sure, Hitler was an evil character without any question. It was almost a moral obligation to get rid of him. But on the other hand, wars have been going on for centuries and forever and ever. And there's always these anti-war feelings that are developed, but they become heroic to young men. And it goes on and on and on. I think young men want to have that experience, and old guys don't. So it's there was a Robert Hughes was a man that wrote a great deal about films. He was very interested in this subject, and he said, you know, you can't make anti-war novels or films because the young people become enamored with this thing. They feel they've missed out on something. They missed out on some. Of course, they have, but they've also missed out on death, which is not evident to them when they're thinking like that. But I don't know. Wars are just hopeless. And they go on and on and on and on. And I certainly I can't think of any solution for that except to have non-wars, but you always have these different parties and different political issues. And think of Africa now with all their problems. Russia is ready to blossom out into some terrible catastrophe with all their the haves and the have-nots kind of thing, you know. So I don't know. I don't. Certainly, having gotten rid of the whole German regime was a great relief. But so what do we got to replace it? You know, not much.
Okay. I don't really have any more questions. Is there anything about that time that sticks out in your mind that we haven't discussed?
Well, I felt that was probably the most important period of my life, because I faced the unknown, and having survived, I felt that nothing could touch me. A little incident. When I was there was a Normandy where I was banged up pretty badly with screaming mimes that landed alongside. I remember the mailman coming back to me with a bill coming from the Book of the Month Club that I was due $1.50 or overdue or something like that. And it was the strangest feeling. Like, imagine they're sending me, but anyone can come up and talk to me from anywhere. They can come up, but no one would. You were in that position where you were absolutely, death was the only thing out there. And yet there was a strange feeling that you were free, because no one would come up to you and whatever you owed or whatever whatever problems you had, you were free. You were totally free in this horrible, terrible position. You were totally free because no one would want to be there or near you in that moment. But it was that I think I came out of the war with, that it did something, that nothing can touch me. Minor things, trivialities of a sort. They always do as a daily kind of thing, but on a philosophic and larger level, it can't, you know. It's almost like, look, I'm living on borrowed time. It's like I made it, and it's all glorious, just being alive. And nothing is going to, a bill won't bother me. My wife was very concerned about such things, but I'm not. So I think it's done that to me. I have a whole different philosophy. My art, I just work at my art because I think I have, in confrontation, it's the art that answers me and myself, and it's a work with material that we can understand each other. And whether I succeed with the work or not doesn't matter. I succeed within the structure of forming the work, which I think the war has contributed to. for that period of my life. So it was very significant.
Terrific.
For a tone?
And the 50 tone.
We just need to sit
Yeah.
here for 30 seconds so they can get the sound of this room when we run it.
Okay.
Did that description with Danielle do it for you, or do you think it's... it did it for me, I'm just...
That's it?
Just,
Move the camera a little and make sure that-
I remember more of the, well, all right.
Well, let's just go through it again and see what other details, if any, come up. It's just,
Yeah.
just so we have a second option.
Okay.
It's a good opportunity for us.
You going, Brian?
Ready.
Page roll.
Go ahead.
Well, when I was coming back from that little sojourn to the
Let's start
bistro,
again. My fault.
yeah, it's okay.
Sorry. Okay, anytime.
When I was coming back from that little session with those French people in the tavern, or the place where they had the champagne, you know, below the floor, I walked back, and it was then I met this girl, and I recall by the Seine, near the bridge of one of the Seine, near the Seine, and it was a glorious sunny day, and she was a beautiful looking girl, and it's a natural tendency to veer toward that as a youth. Then I went toward her, and as I recall, I had some chocolate bars or something, and cigarettes, and I probably made a gesture and say hi and hello, and the conversation started. But what was perhaps the best thing that happened was she spoke English, and that started a whole different thing going, because in order to carry a conversation, she had said that she was a medical student. I thought, well, now, you know, I could say a thing such as, do you know Picasso? Have you heard of Picasso? And of course, she was well aware of that. And it was at that moment I thought maybe this was the time to do something like this. Take me to Picasso's studio. And she since she knew where he might be, and this is how we left. But I can't remember much more than the sort of atmosphere that existed, the sunshine and the feeling of that liberation and that total thing in the midst of the war, and also the feeling that the war is over. Almost all these things simultaneously happening. It was a kind of a joyous thing, and that was an added portion of that thing. God, to see Picasso and to go that way under those circumstances with this young, pretty woman, was just too much to ask for. But anyway, that's how we met. And that being stuck off on the side streets with all these other activities, not being able to do it, was just such a great disappointment. But Danielle is there to, she's always part of Paris, and that liberation for me.
You know, it might be useful is what
Yeah. But I know it's got to be beautiful. Go ahead.
What's just, what do you remember about it? Anything about the detail of the...
Well, she was a beautiful girl, because I'm attracted to beauty, and she was beautiful, and young, and a student. And in this conversation also, I asked her about her parents, and her parents at that time were located in Le Havre, which was not liberated yet. And I remember her concern about her parents, because she didn't know, here was Paris liberated, and she didn't know what might have happened or would be happening in Le Havre with her parents. But I remember that now. It just came back to me like that. And she was concerned about them. But she was a pretty young medical student at the Sorbonne, and on a sunny, glorious holiday, you might say. And you know, with a young man at that age, there's no questioning about that's the way it was. You know? And like I say, the culmination, of course, would have been the meeting with Picasso. That would have topped it. But the stories never go that way, you know, only in romances. But anyway, we'll see.
Okay. Let's do that. Okay, we're just going to sit here quietly for the room tone.
Barry said, one day, if I ever became famous, what I could do would be sign each chip that comes out of the statue or the piece of sculpture, and I would be able to sell each chip for $1 a signature. So I thought maybe I would try one and see if I could sell it. And I think probably the best place for it would be as kindling. These chips would make good burning wood. So I'll have to tell Barry that. The Bishop of Redoux. Redoux is a small town in Belgium. Sohl and myself were sent ahead on a mission to get a command post for the colonel. And the front lines were very vague at the time, but we were moving forward on the front. And Al and I were given the job to go ahead to the next village, which was called Redoux, and find a proper place for headquarters so that the colonel could come in and everything would be prepared. So we went up in a jeep and we had some communications. We had telephone men with us, and we got into this little village, and we looked at the best house in the place, of course, to lodge the colonel and make it his headquarters. And what we found was the priest and a few nuns and some of the populace, and they came out to greet us. And it was a very volatile situation at the time. The Germans probably would arrive at any time if the front opened up in that direction. So we sent, they were frightened on, I might say, and were betwixt and between because they didn't know what the situation was on the front. So we sent them back to the rear, and we took over the headquarters and were preparing the building. So we had a marvelous building, and well, the best building in the village. We had a huge bed, and we had candlesticks, huge candlesticks that they used in the church. So we blocked out the windows, Al and I did, and we had to wait for the colonel. So the colonel never arrived, and so that they probably were due tomorrow. So we had this huge bed, which we used, and we lit the candles. Then we were talking about what we would do in a frontline situation, a map, and pushing the troops around and so on. We were playing Colonel and so on, and just waiting there, and hoping that there wouldn't be a counterattack or something like that. And so the man, the priest that we sent back to the rear, we referred to as the Bishop of Redoux. And forever, Al and I have always talked about the Bishop of Redoux. This is my interpretation of the Bishop of Redoux. Doesn't look anything like it, but I think it's appropriate.